Hi guys, I'm Shmi, hello and welcome back to the channel where today we're going to talk about something you might have seen recently in the news. McLaren have issued a recall for quite a few cars, including some Sennas, and in fact on my last upload, I think about 20% of the comments were asking me, has my Senna been recalled? Well, today we will talk about what exactly they have done, what it means, whether my car is affected, as well as telling you a little bit more actually at this point, now that I've owned the Senna for about a year and a half, what the costs involved in this car have been. I think it might be quite interesting to go over some of the costings of a car like this as opposed to some of the other Shmeemobiles here in the garage. So today, the Senna, the recall, what is going on? Quite clearly, this video is a direct response to the questions from you guys. I've been getting emails, messages, DMs across every platform, even comments on pictures, whether they're about the Senna or something completely unrelated. And also the last video I uploaded, taking you through a complete induction tour of the newest Shmeemobile, my SLS AMG Black Series. Quite literally 1 in 5 comments were asking me my thoughts on the recall and is my car affected? Now I think quite a few of you might have seen the video by my friend Alejandro Drin, where he gave his input. Now, of course, Alejandro was a former owner of a Senna himself. Obviously, that had quite an unfortunate and sad story behind it just a few days after I took delivery of mine back in December 2018. Well, I wanted to clarify a few things about this, some things you might not know behind the recall process, why this story has become quite so big at the moment. Also, have there been any previous recalls to the car that you might not know about and why that is well as my car included? There's clearly quite a lot to this, and obviously there's a big backstory with what happened to Alejandro's car, what also happened to my friend Jer Collector's car. I think you probably know about those two incidents, and is this recall connected to those? Let's go through it all. While I think a lot of people have seen the headline titles that say the McLaren Senna has been recalled, I imagine many don't know exactly what this is about and why. So let's take a step back to explain it a little bit. The recall that you've seen comes from the NHTSA over in the USA. The NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, have recalled a total of 2,763 cars, all of which are based in the United States. So I don't know what's going to happen with cars around the world at this stage, but the NHTSA have published their recall details, which include a total of 2,008 720Ss, 373 570 GTs, 225 new McLaren GTs, and of course the headline, 157 of the 500 Sennas. Now I take that to assume that McLaren delivered 157 of the 500 cars in total over in the US to begin with. Of course, they've gone on to make 75 additional GTRs, 20 LMs, and a further 3 Can-Ams, plus a few prototypes that are out there as well, but it's those 157 cars, which means at this stage at least, that obviously does not include mine. We'll have to wait and see what happens around the world. But what actually is this recall? Well, it's to do with a foam pad that is about reducing vibrations, and to be honest, I'm surprised that this car has any foam pads that reduce vibrations, but it's one in particular which you can imagine in the 720S and 570 GT, sits beneath the fuel tank. You've got the filler cap back here, so it sits under the fuel tank, and if it was to retain moisture, it could potentially corrode away the base of the fuel tank, which could cause a fuel leak, and of course that could lead to an incendiary incident. Now, McLaren have very specifically said that this recall is to do with 2 cars that have been impacted, both of which are 570 GTs. The first was back in early 2019. It was an Express car that had a lot of miles over in Latvia. The second car was earlier this year, February 2020, which was a car here in the UK. So it hasn't actually affected any Sennas. That I think is more to do with some of the previous recalls involving the car. So the backstory there, I guess, is that it doesn't initially affect this car, but it might in future. I think sound deadening foam pads make more sense in the GT style cars than they do in the Senna, because when you drive this thing, it is constant rattles and loud noise, but that's what's been announced so far. You might be quite surprised by this, but it's not all that unusual for cars like these to have recalls. When you're talking about high-performance, limited edition, hand-built cars, they just tend to be things that are fixed during annual services. Like I said, my Senna had one last year, which I'll touch on later on. The Ford GT had some hydraulic lines replaced, and you might remember as well, about 2 years ago, when I was in the south of France on a road trip in my AMG GTR at the time, it experienced something that affected early GTRs, where a stone effectively pierced the intercooler at the front end, which led to the potential for the gearbox to overheat, while Mercedes issued a bulletin to install a mesh over the front of that, which we can actually see on the front of the GTR Pro down here. Just inside, it now has that black mesh over the front of the intercooler, which just reduces the risk of that happening, which has been retrospectively installed on GTRs as well. Those kind of things. Normally with recalls, they're things that are critical for safety, but not very exciting. Things like airbags and seat belts, you might see them from Volkswagen or from Ford and not really pay any attention, which is where I find the Senna quite interesting. Of course, Sennas have been a little bit cursed, obviously what happened to mine, but also two particularly public incendiary incidents. The one that happened to a famous YouTuber and one that happened at a Formula One race. Now I can tell you, I know people who have experienced LaFerraris burning down, P1s burning down, 918s burning down, Aventadors burning down. It is a risk with cars of this performance level, and in fact many of them even come with a fire extinguisher. My Senna has one just under the passenger seat in case of this risk. It is something about, inherently, I guess, about very high performance cars. So the Senna has this kind of curse, which I think makes this an even bigger story than it perhaps otherwise would be. In fact, I think last year's recall, which I need to explain, was probably a bigger deal overall. In fact, that is to do with the wiring loom inside the rear end, and basically I believe to do with it being too close potentially to the exhaust system or other things that can get particularly hot. Obviously, that's where you run the real risks. So that had to be replaced on my car, as it was, I think, on every Senna around the world, in fact, last year. But obviously, at this kind of slow news period, the fact that there's a recall to a car like this really stands out. Now, there have been numerous other incidents involving exciting cars and supercars, and two that stand out from my memory from the time that I've been involved in cars. The first was back with the Ferrari 458 Italia when it was brand new. I think about 5 or 6 cars caught fire, which turned out to be some glue in the rear wheel arch, which of course got too hot and caught fire. Another one you might remember, Porsche with the 991.1 GT3. After they had delivered about 800 cars or so, 2 of them caught fire, which turned out to be a connecting rod bolt damaging the crankshaft and meaning those cars caught fire. And in fact, Porsche replaced the engines in all 800 first-gen GT3s of the 991. Pretty big effort. Of course, it did mean that cars had different engine numbers, but a lot of owners were actually compensated for the time that their cars were off the road, because as soon as they issued the recall, everybody basically had to stop driving to ensure it didn't happen to any further cars. It was quite a big thing back at the time. So these things kind of happen. They're just things that I think you get. And this sounds really strange, but you just get a little bit used to with these kind of cars. You expect things, because they're hand-built, will need to be fixed. You expect things are going to need to be changed, and it's just kind of part and parcel of the experience almost. Before we go into some of the running costs then of the Senna, by way of a conclusion to this topic, this car has not yet been called back in. Who knows what will happen with it? Maybe it was already done at the service last year. Normally with these things, you might get a letter telling you it needs to go straight to the dealership. Maybe you'd get a phone call. In the case of this specific announcement though, it only affects cars in the USA for the time being. We will find out in due course. So to talk about the car in terms of what it costs then to run and keep in the garage. Now the Senna is of course the highest performing car that makes up the lineup of Shmee-mobiles. It is also the most expensive, which does bring with it a very, I guess, cautious attitude and a very expensive one to maintain it properly. Now like all cars here, it comes as new with a 3-year warranty. I don't know what the warranty extension will be when the time comes. For the moment, it needs to go for its annual service every 10,000 miles or 12 months. And I think, let's be real, not many of them are going to do 10,000 miles in a year, so realistically it's going in once a year to have the service done. Now the interesting thing about the service for the Senna is that of course it shares many components with the 720S. It's built around a different actual carbon fibre monocage tub, but it shares similarities in the engine and some of the suspension components, which means servicing wise it's not that astoundingly expensive. It's about, I think, £1,000 to £1,500 a year, which I know is a big amount of money, but it's no more really than taking one of the Mercedes. Maybe they're just under £1,000. The Aston I think is about £600 or £700, but the 675 LT, which is a third of the price of the Senna, is about the same. So from a servicing perspective, it's not totally crazy. Other costs, of course, storage, parking it here in the supercar storage, the same as any other car. Normal, I guess, other costs, things like tyres. Tyres aren't very expensive for these kind of cars, contrary to what you might think. They're no more expensive than run flats for a 5 Series BMW or something, maybe $1,000 for a full set around the car. But obviously you don't do many miles unless you're out on the track, so you don't need them too frequently. One thing that's painfully expensive are the brakes. If you ever need new brakes, I think it's about, for a full set of discs, pads all around, about as much as a Focus RS. It's under the cover at the moment, but maybe 35 grand, something like that, something that's moderately terrifying. One of the other costs, obviously, that's very big is to do with the insurance. Obviously, you need to have a value connected with the car, which, like every car at this time, is currently, I think, probably depreciating quite quickly, which actually makes your insurance longer term a little bit less, but you want to have a guaranteed value attached. You need to insure it for all the kind of usage that you're going to do with the car, and if I ever want to insure someone else to drive it, I have to add them to the policy, which has a cost associated as well. So the insurance is very high. It's a percentage of value. In fact, the Senna insurance is, well, it's certainly more than all of those put together. It's a big number. It's a strong number. So that's one of the main considerations with the car. Overall, though, this, as these kind of cars go, isn't that crazy. I mean, something like a Mercedes SLR McLaren, for example, those have astronomical servicing costs. Porsche Carrera GTs, some of those cars cost significantly more than this to maintain and to keep running. This only really gets expensive when you use it a lot. Like I said, with the brakes, with that kind of thing, taking it to tracks, obviously with the amount of grip it has, it smokes through some tyres pretty quickly as well if you want it to. So you have to watch out for those kind of things. And any parts, as I've experienced, any parts are excruciating to deal with. And of course, this car had its incident coming up now to almost 12 months, which unfortunately still isn't actually resolved. That's something I don't talk about often, but behind the scenes, there's a whole legal thing around that to try and get it resolved and sorted out as soon as possible, which has consumed way more hours than I ever imagined it possibly could. But anyway, hopefully at some point in the not forever future, that is going to get sorted out. So from a servicing perspective and cost perspective, it's not really that insane. As cars go, the Senna isn't, it's the insurance, but outside of insurance, the car itself doesn't cost that much more to run than a 675 LT type car. It's only if something happens or if you put a lot through it. Now, similarly with the Ford GT, but the Ford GT servicing actually, just done at a Ford dealer, is very reasonable. I think it's like 500 quid for the oil change and filter. No big deal, basically. Tyres, very hard to get, though, very expensive. Michelin Sport Cup 2s, Pirelli Trofeo Rs on the Senna, and obviously a mixture of tyres, actually, Sport Cup 2, Sport Cup 2, Sport Cup 2 on those in the garage, all generally running on their OEM tyres. So yes, I think that's more or less what I wanted to say about the cost of the Senna, and explaining a little bit more of this recall, which I think a lot of people, I guess, don't fully understand. I think last year's recall was more to do with the fiery incidents that we've seen than this year's, but I guess with not all that much going on, it stands out. The Senna has been recalled. I guess it grabs some attention and some headlines. But there we go. That's my opinion and my thoughts on exactly the story at the moment. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it answers some of your questions. So thank you very much for watching. As always, guys, that's it for this time, and I'll see you again very soon. Cheers.